Welcome to the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy here at Boston College. My name is Patricia McCoy, and I am the new incoming faculty director of the Rappaport Center. I've been on the advisory board for 10 years, so this is truly a labor of love for me. Dan Canstrom, also on our faculty, was the prior faculty director, and just suffice it to say, I have very big shoes to fill. So today I am delighted to kick off our first Rappaport Center spring event. Our panel today is on the troubling and persistent issue of human trafficking. So let me turn it over to our executive director, Amanda Teo, to introduce our event and our moderator. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Professor McCoy. Even though you've really long been a champion of this center, serving as a member of our advisory board, being one of our most enthusiastic and committed audience members, we are very grateful to welcome you today to your first panel as faculty director. Alexis Albert, the center's assistant, and I, and this whole community are really excited for the next chapter of the center under your leadership. So thank you. Before we begin, a quick note, this panel is being recorded. So whether it's the Epstein files or the prosecution of Sean Combs, media coverage of trafficking tends to focus on sex trafficking, and sex trafficking only. And within that, on the people with power and celebrity who are the perpetrators. So when people learn that I'm a board member of the Children's Advocacy Center of Suffolk County, and that I've done some work in prosecution and enforcement of human trafficking in the past, people invariably get very excited. They always ask the same set of questions. So who else is going to be charged? How are they going to be punished? But almost never do they ask, who are the survivors? What is their story? What do they need to heal? We talk a lot about survivors as the ones doing, and certainly they're doing harm. And we imagine ourselves as people who are capable of putting an end to their action. But we don't talk nearly enough about what survivors are doing. The survivors I've worked with span the gamut of demographics. They are new arrivals without immigration status. They are young people who have been systems involved. They are tweens from middle-class suburbs. And what unites them is not their identity, but rather the fact and the action of their surviving. Survival is not a label, it's not a passive state, it is a work, it is negotiation, it is courage demonstrated day after day, moment after moment. And that work can be supported or it can be undermined by systems and individuals who have really good intentions but don't necessarily know how to support or facilitate. So I'm really grateful today for our panelists and also to our partners in the community from Suffolk County, the Children's Advocacy Center of Suffolk County, and also My Life, My Choice, who are here with resources for all of us so that we can learn how to intervene in ways that are survivor-focused, survivor-centered. All of you, our panelists today, as well as the teams from My Life, My Choice and from Suffolk CAC, have modeled purposeful, inclusive, humble work in service of facilitating or supporting survivors in this work. And we want to learn from you how we can better support you. And it's now my honor to introduce our moderator, Professor Julie Dahlstrom. Julie Dahlstrom is the Associate Dean of Clinical and Experiential Education and Director of the Immigrants' Rights and Human Trafficking Program at Boston University Law School. In 2012, she founded the Human Trafficking Clinic. It's one of the first of its kind. And it is an amazing clinical legal program that supports students dedicated to representing survivors of human trafficking in all forms. We're really grateful to have her guide this conversation today, and I encourage all of you to help me give her a very warm welcome as she introduces the panelists as well. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you for being here. It's wonderful to look out in this audience. I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a moment. We have an incredible panel for you today. But to look out in the audience and also see advocates, experts, people who've been in the field for many, many years. So I know it's going to be an incredibly fruitful conversation. I want to start by thanking again Amanda Teo, Alexis Albert, Professor McCoy, and the Rappaport Center for taking on this issue at such an important moment. As many of you may know, it's National Human Trafficking Awareness Month, so thank you for being in the room for that. But it's also 25 years after the Trafficking Protocol was established internationally and after the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was established federally. So we're in an enormously important moment to look back at the contributions that legislation has made, but also what may be many of the gaps, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So I just want to briefly situate us, and then we're going to introduce the panelists and throw out some questions, and then invite you all to ask questions as well. So we're sitting 25 years after the international community came together to establish the Trafficking Protocol, which many of you may know is situated within the Organized Crime Convention, meaning that it situated trafficking as an issue of crime control, immigration, and border enforcement. And many have credited both that protocol and later federal legislation as playing a critical role. In fact, a seismic shift in leading to the enactment of both domestic, international, regional initiatives to combat trafficking. Legal scholar Ann Gallagher noted, without the protocol, it's likely that the human rights system would have continued its shameful tradition of sidelining issues like forced labor, forced sex, forced marriage, and the ritual exploitation of migrant workers. Importantly, that protocol provided the impetus and template for a series of legal and political developments that over time would get at this issue of trafficking. So that protocol and federal law is not without criticism. That's in part why we're here today. But it was important in providing consensus and momentum around the issue of trafficking. So while there have been incredible developments during the last 2 decades, on the 25th anniversary, human trafficking, as you know, persists as a global problem and a local problem. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. And despite formal legal mechanisms and protections, survivors still find themselves often at the intersection of exclusionary immigration systems, immigration enforcement, insufficient labor laws, punitive criminal immigration systems, and who's the most impacted? Often marginalized groups, whether that's survivors of color, indigenous peoples, LGBTQ plus individuals. And those concerns have only intensified in the present moment. So we're going to dive into that today and hear from our panelists about, why does trafficking persist despite this legal framework that's quite robust? How does it manifest now in Massachusetts? What are the big challenges? And finally, of course, if you're here today, what are the possibilities beyond prosecution in addressing those global issues? So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. We could spend quite a long time. They're incredible, and I've worked with each of them in different capacities. So I'm just going to share a little bit about them and invite them also throughout their remarks to share more. Jose Alfaro is a lived experience expert and an advocate who currently works as an anti-trafficking advocate, peer support specialist, and consultant. He serves on the U.S. Advisory Council to the White House as vice chair, has been featured in several publications, including an op-ed in the Boston Globe that you should check out, and other publications like NPR, PBS, Rolling Stone, and Insight Edition, just to name a few. Beth Keeley is a partner at Butner's Brazilian LLP, where she's done incredible pro bono work and private work representing survivors of sex trafficking. With a career spanning from her early days at Suffolk County as a Suffolk County prosecutor and her past leadership role as the chief of the Human Trafficking Division at the Office of the Attorney General in Massachusetts, she brings a wealth of experience in addressing challenging cases in the context of sexual violence and human trafficking and navigating those sensitive issues. And finally, Cindy Freeland is a partner at Wilmer Hale's litigation group with a focus on patent and trade secret litigation. She was twice named Boston's Patent Lawyer of the Year by Best Lawyers in America, and has been recognized by Chambers USA, Managing IP, IAM Patent of 1000, and Boston Magazine for her intellectual property practice litigation. And on the side, and in addition, she maintains an active pro bono practice supporting trafficking victims and survivors in really groundbreaking litigation. So we're going to get to hear a little bit about all of that, but we're going to start by just talking about some definitional issues. When people hear the term human trafficking, they may have different ideas. Often, currently, it refers to often forced labor or sex trafficking. But I want to ask you, there are many things, as Amanda mentioned, that they tend to get wrong or misconceptions that may guide our work. And so I'm going to open it up first to Jose to just share a little bit about your sense of what trafficking means and who is often sort of left out of conversations around trafficking.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for being here and being eager to learn and understand the complexities of this horrific crime. But I do want to share a little bit of background, and I also want to share that being part of the U.S. Advisory Council, all of the opinions and perspectives that I share here today are those of my own and not reflective or representative of the council as a whole. I just have to share that to begin with. But to give you a little bit of background, in 2018 I testified in the federal trial against my trafficker, who ultimately was sentenced to 30 years in prison with no chance of parole. There were 3 other male victims who had come forward and testified. I also will discuss further throughout these questions kind of what that process was like, how things could have been better, and also what justice could look like. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of that background. To answer your question, which is a very complex and many questions, I think that we could all spend about a week talking about all of the different realities. But that being said, I think that there are many misconceptions when it comes to trafficking. And I'm going to start off with explaining the misconceptions when it comes to victims of this crime. Many people believe that victims of this crime are kidnapped, held against their will, taken from or taken to distant countries. Many people believe that this only happens to females. More importantly, many people believe that this only happens to white cis females, which is furthest from the truth. I just want to share with you that anyone can be a victim to this crime, but I really want to highlight something that Julie already mentioned, which is that many marginalized and underserved people are whom this is disproportionately happening to. And this is many times due to their vulnerabilities and lack of system supports. And so I think that that's really crucial in understanding when doing this work. When it comes to perpetrators, I say a lot of things that sometimes people can kind of gasp at or clutch their pearls when I talk about perpetrators, but perpetrators are also in that same category of marginalized and underserved people. Not always, but more times than most because of that survival piece and that vulnerable piece that we're talking about today. And so I think that it's really important to understand that, first and foremost, that they are human, but also that many people have this idea that these perpetrators are like these masterminds, when in reality they tend to be people that are very close to the victims more times than most. Say a family member, a parent, or even just a trusted official or someone within their community that they trust. I think that these are usually happening in this way because of that trust piece that is already built and foundational to that relationship, where they can easily manipulate into a situation like trafficking. And then last but not least, I wanted to discuss the misconceptions of exploitation or human trafficking as a whole. One way that I like to explain to people, because I at one time didn't understand the difference between human trafficking and sex trafficking, which was the first question that I asked the prosecutor in the case, is I don't understand how I'm a victim to this crime, and what is the difference between sex trafficking and human trafficking, because I fully don't understand and I want to. So that educational piece is really critical and important. And the response that I got is basically human trafficking is an umbrella term, and that there are many different forms of exploitation and trafficking that happen that fall under that umbrella term. And I also want to highlight that not all forms of exploitation are trafficking as well. But just to name a few of the forms of trafficking that exist, two of the most common, I would probably say, are sex trafficking and labor trafficking. But there are many others, from domestic servitude in the ways that people could be labor trafficked or sex trafficked. I'm sure you've heard a little bit about organ trafficking as well. That is something that exists. I don't know too much about organ trafficking, but it is something that many people should be aware of and educated on as well. I think that understanding the misconceptions matters, because many survivors are victim blamed, they're not believed, or many times they are stigmatized, whether it be from community members, friend groups, law enforcement, attorneys. I mean, everyone is kind of involved in this. I think for there to be effective legal responses, it requires, obviously, the accurate understanding of who victims are, who they could be, and how trafficking operates. And so I really wanted to take a little bit of time to kind of dig into a moment where misconceptions happened in my own case with the prosecutor and the HSI investigator that was working on my specific case. And it came 3 years after my trafficker was sentenced, and we were participating in a case study. And right before the case study, the prosecutor says, and excitedly says, Jose, I don't know if you realize, but this case initially was a child sexual abuse material case. This was not a human trafficking case. And I kept thinking about what details of this case that I knew and how it initially had started. How it started was my trafficker was caught taking a 15-year-old boy to London with the purpose of sex trafficking him through his massage business. And so what more of an exploitative and similar to the movie Taken type of situation do you need to have to recognize that this is a crime of human trafficking, and not so much only or just CSAM. And for those of you who don't know, CSAM is child sexual abuse material. And so I had to ask the question, why and how did you not see that this was human trafficking? And then I said, better yet, actually, don't answer that question. Is it because this was a male victim and not a female victim? And she paused, and she says, no, yes. And immediately I knew, I'm like, I get it. You want to struggle and not tell the truth, but you know that the best way for us to move forward and understand this is by being truthful and honest and help others learn from the mistakes that may have happened in our own case. That's the whole point of a case study. And then the HSI agent intervened, and she said, well, Jose, you have to understand that at that time, we just really didn't have education on males being victims of trafficking. And I just sat there and I'm like, well, then how many male victims are out there who were never identified, never believed, or are incarcerated, or are, at worst, dead by suicide at this point in time in their life, or addicted to drugs. And so it really kind of motivated me to continue to do this work and really highlight those misconceptions, but also speak out on how this deeply impacts all people, and especially male victims as well. And so I just wanted to leave you with just this understanding that if you plan on doing this work within the sector, I urge you to continue to be educated, attend similar and more trainings like today, and truly understand the realities and how common and human this issue truly is, but also continue to learn from other lived experts and survivors of this crime as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
And then we'll turn to Beth, if there's anything you want to add.
I have the misfortune of following Jose. There's really not much to add. I think I'll speak to my some points that I think I wanted to make for you all. But again, thank you, Jose. And thank you all for being here and taking the time out of your day to pay attention and to learn. As Jose pointed out, is what we always need to be striving for. So I want to just, I guess, start by giving a little bit more about my background. You heard that I currently work in a private practice in a small firm, but for about 15 years, I worked as a prosecutor in the state of Massachusetts. And so I worked at the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office in Boston for many years. And towards the end of my time there, I led the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Unit. And then I moved over to the Attorney General's office under then Attorney General, now Governor Maura Healey, where I led the Human Trafficking Division there in the Criminal Bureau for about 5.5 years. And I've been in practice for private practice for about 4 years now, but as you can tell, the majority of my practice up to now has been as a prosecutor. So as someone who worked bringing these cases on behalf of the government, and as a prosecutor, I have some insight to share there. And I think I just kind of wanted to sketch out some initial pieces of information for you to think about as we're having this conversation. So, as I mentioned, I was a prosecutor in Massachusetts. And so just to be clear, we have a state law in Massachusetts. We have a set of state laws in Massachusetts focused on addressing human trafficking, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, organ trafficking, and comprehensive legislation that deals with a myriad of issues related to human trafficking. But of course here we're focusing on, or I think we're led with the idea that the federal statute led Massachusetts many years before we got our statute on the books in 2011 and 2012. So the federal prosecutions are led by U.S. attorneys, and federal agents like HSI or FBI. In the state prosecutors work with local law enforcement. I work with Boston Police and the state police, as well as with service providers, victim advocates. What one of the I think sort of evolutions in Massachusetts when we got our act together and got our state law on the books was the concept of really focusing on multidisciplinary teams and focusing on trafficking, in particular sex trafficking and child sex trafficking, focusing on this model of bringing together prosecutors with police, with advocates, with resources at the first blush to really try to do as best as we could to address the situation with all hands on deck and with all the resources that the criminal justice system could possibly try to bring together. So in Massachusetts, when we're talking about sex trafficking and labor trafficking, obviously there's legal definitions and many folks will look into those and explore them, but in general we're talking about sex trafficking knowingly enabling or facilitating commercial sexual exploitation, commercial sexual activity. And labor trafficking, we're talking in general about knowingly enabling or facilitating forced services of another individual. And so, I think many times folks are trying to think about if they're not, part of a prosecution team or sort of more in depth in this world, how do these cases arise? How do prosecutors really get alerted to them? How do they know to bring them in the first place? And I will say, as has been highlighted, it's true that in general we have a lot more sex trafficking prosecutions than labor trafficking prosecutions. and organ trafficking. I'm not even sure we have any on the books in the state, but I think part of that has to do with the way that law enforcement in general sort of gets tuned into the possibility of an investigation or a prosecution, right? So with sex trafficking, it may be that there's an intersection with criminality that is available for law enforcement to follow up on. That is to say, maybe there's an instance of domestic violence or sexual assault that's reported. Maybe there's a suspicion of child abuse or child exploitation that's reported to protective services in the state. And so there are ways that enforcement entities government entities are clued in and can really sort of get the ball started. With labor trafficking, as we would often say at the Attorney General's office, there's nothing inherently alarming about someone working, right? And so if someone is cleaning a room after hours, who's going to go up to that person and say, are you being trafficked? Is it what's happening here? Is this the product of forced labor? And so that in general, I would say those are sort of some of the general ideas there. I would also say with labor trafficking in general, there's a myriad of additional issues, including potential immigration barriers, a number of different obstructions that are often there, that may be there in sex trafficking cases, but I would say with labor trafficking, the potential to bring labor trafficking cases can be particularly difficult because of the intersection of immigration or cultural issues that may prevent law enforcement from being able to connect with folks. I think one thing I also wanted to highlight one thing, but several things I guess in terms of thinking about why do we want to focus on prosecution as something that is available. I know we're going to talk about beyond prosecution, but it is true that this is a way to hold traffickers accountable, right? So bringing cases, criminal prosecutions to bear does allow us to hold traffickers accountable. It highlights to the public that this is an issue and that that law enforcement is trying to do something to address these issues and to hold folks accountable. It protects folks in the community and in particular those that may be victimized. And as I mentioned with the concept here in Massachusetts in particular, with multidisciplinary teams and the connection of advocates and resources alongside a prosecution, it may be a way to provide resources and supports to victims and survivors. But I think one of the things we really want to focus on, or we're sort of get over to talk what we can do beyond prosecution is, there are limits to prosecutions and what we can do with them or how they can address the issues that human trafficking writ large sort of brings to the table. I think the framework of the criminal justice system, as Amanda highlighted, is really designed to focus on the trafficker and holding the trafficker accountable. That's the goal, right? How can we find accountability and how can we hold that person responsible and sentence them? So that, as we heard, oftentimes may leave survivors' needs unmet or lacking, and so that's where we need to sort of continue to be thinking and educating ourselves and trying to work on what's next beyond the prosecution, right? So I think Jose's highlighted one example. I'm sure we can hear more, but one thing I was thinking about, and we've talked about in the past, Julie, is the concept of restitution, right? In federal prosecutions, restitution, that is some way to compensate the victims and survivors for monetary losses they've sustained. It's mandatory. That's excellent that that's a mandatory thing in federal prosecutions. Whether it's always attainable is another question, right? And in the state level of prosecutions, restitution is not actually, it's not necessarily part of the equation, right? It's not mandatory, and it's rarely thought of, to be honest. So I think now in my civil practice, I've been able to continue to assist survivors in different ways. I'm not bringing prosecutions across the state, but I'm able to help individuals in specific ways. I've done some pro bono work with survivors who've had criminal cases that they are seeking to have addressed, and feel lucky to be able to do that and to provide assistance in that way. I've been able to help folks with restraining orders on occasion as well. Vacatur and sealing is, I think, another thing that we'll talk about as an opportunity beyond prosecution to help survivors. There's also, the ability to help folks with UNT visa applications and to bring civil actions on behalf of survivors, because the TVPRA and even the Massachusetts statute does allow for civil right of action for survivors, and I think it's important for us to think about ways to continue to bring those forward. And so those are some of the thoughts I wanted to share, and look forward to further conversation.
Great, and we'll move to Cynthia, but before that, for those of you thinking about a career in prosecution, I just want to note, I think we often think of a traditional role as a prosecutor moving cases forward in the criminal context, but really to commend Beth, because in this role as chief of the Human Trafficking Division, she was able to think creatively. She was very engaged in policy-related work, legislative work, out doing advocacy work, building up partnerships, like she mentioned, multidisciplinary partnerships that really thought more holistically. So there are ways, although constraints, to think creatively in that space. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cindy.
So glad to be here as well today. And my experience has largely been on the civil side. I've had the great honor of having represented a number of amazing women who have been trafficking survivors, and including in the first civil case against a hotel or motel under the TVPRA. And I think we'll maybe talk about that later. But on this start of conceptions, misconceptions, and how they impact things, there's another side of the criminal justice system too that I think is important here, and that's when trafficking survivors find themselves in court. I mean, to Jose's point, there's this misperception that people that are trafficked are people that are stolen away from their families in the middle of the night, but it is so much more common for young people to be targeted and exploited by people they know. And it's truly an immense problem. And just a couple statistics that just break my heart but scream to the immensity of the problem. The average age, and I think Audrey, who's here from My Life, My Choice, just knows this firsthand. The average age at which girls are first sold for sex nationally is 13 to 15. And it's probably even younger in Massachusetts, and it's certainly younger for LGBTQ youth. And just, one, to underscore how often this happens, I worked on a case in Georgia a couple of years ago, and we cited a study to the court there to highlight the immensity of the problem. In Georgia, this study concluded that more than 12,000 men per month paid for sex with an adolescent under 18 girl. And I think it underscores the immensity of the problem, and it matters immensely when these youth end up in the criminal justice system, which so often happens. I mean, young people can rack up criminal charges, criminal records for things that are related and spring from their trafficking. Not just prostitution offenses, but drug offenses, robbery offenses, things that are pushed on them by their trafficker. And once these young people land a record, it makes it so much harder for them to get back on their feet. And I know that Audrey and others in this space have been doing so much advocacy to try to change perceptions here. And I will say on this, and since I know we've got a lot of law students in the audience, one of the most moving statements I've seen on this from a criminal perspective is the work of a judge in New York named Fernando Camacho. And I have copies of this article here for anyone who wants to see how he expressed it. But he himself started as a prosecutor, prosecuting, giving young people 20-day sentences for prostitution. Then he became a judge, and he did the same thing. He was doling out these 20-day sentences for prostitution. And over the course of this, he realized that he was looking in the eyes not of criminals, but of young people who had been terribly, terribly exploited by people they knew. And he went on to develop the first, in New York it's called the Human Trafficking Intervention Court. It was the first court in the country to see trafficking survivors as, not criminals, but people who had been exploited and people who needed social services, who needed counseling, who needed housing help, who needed immigration help. And the goal of those courts was to help these survivors get the services they need rather than put them in jail. And since that, I would say over the last 10, 20 years, and I think his was really some seminal work in New York, there's definitely been an effort to open eyes, I would say in Massachusetts, across the country, across the world. Other countries are moving in this direction too, to recognize that oftentimes people who are landing in court are not criminals, they are survivors of something awful, and we should get them help. So I think that's another definitely how a terrible misconception, that trafficking survivors can be treated as criminals rather than survivors. And I don't know what order we're going to do this, but I'd be happy to talk about some of my civil work on behalf of survivors, but there might be some more questions first.
No, thank you for that, Cindy. And I think often we view this binary between sort of a survivor and a defendant, but often, as we know, survivors themselves are criminalized in different contexts, so I appreciate you highlighting that. I think first we'll just go back to Beth just briefly on the criminal prosecution piece. So as many of you know, with federal legislation, it really aimed to combat trafficking through the lens of criminal prosecution, prevention, and benefits or protections, but many of those protections were connected to a survivor's engagement with the criminal system. So I just wanted to invite you, if there's anything else you wanted to share about, what does the criminal prosecution process look like, and what challenges did you see as a prosecutor, or did you see survivors engage with throughout that process?
Sure. So, to really sort of outline a criminal process, in order to bring forward a prosecution, a team, a prosecutor and who worked in law enforcement in particular would need to hear firsthand, more often than not always, but more often than not, from a survivor about their experience. Now, I will say in Massachusetts, we were able to bring some cases in the Attorney General's office where we were able to prevail on our ability to bring sex trafficking cases not based or rooted entirely in the testimony of survivors. But I would say, in general, a prosecution would start with hearing from an individual or set of individuals about what they're experiencing, right? And so taking that information, that report of their experience, bringing that into a grand jury, having grand jurors evaluate what they're saying, what their testimony is, making a probable cause assessment, moving that then with, maybe some other witnesses as well, maybe not, forward into a criminal court, right, where an individual who's been identified as a defendant, the person who's been accused of doing the trafficking, either sex trafficking or labor trafficking, will be brought to court, arraigned for the criminal indictments against them, and then the case proceeds in criminal court, right? And so a number of things could happen along the way, but many times we understand that these cases end up needing to be tried. And so that is another instance where a survivor may have to get into court and tell their story and get on the stand and face the public, their accuser, and talk about the harms they've endured. So there's a lot of trauma, obviously, we're talking about, that goes into these situations to begin with. But I don't take it lightly to think about, in thinking about, I should say, the additional trauma that asking an individual to talk in detail about their trafficking experience requires. And for some individuals that may be empowering, and that may be an opportunity for them to really sort of be in a position to point the finger or sort of take command of their story. And for other individuals, it's just not. It is not the end all be all, and it's not. That is not what justice looks like to them. And so, I think prosecutors, I know when I did this work, my understanding of this evolved, to be honest, over time in considering the work that I did. And I think that as prosecutors, we do have to keep that in mind. It's not obvious to everyone that a prosecution is the end-all be-all in the way to attain justice. Certainly it is important in many instances, and yet, as we've talked about, there are limits to it, and there can be, frustrations.
And maybe this is a nice point to ask Cindy. So after federal legislation was passed in 2000, there was additional legislation passed, the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, or we're saying TVPRA, that allowed for a federal civil remedy. It really opened up additional civil avenues for survivors. Subsequent in Massachusetts, we also now have a state civil remedy. And Cindy has played a pivotal role in terms of litigation, especially in Massachusetts. And that litigation also opened up avenues against other defendants, other individuals that may have knowingly benefited from the trafficking. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Cindy. What have those avenues meant? And also, could you talk a little bit about the Riccio case and its impact?
Yeah, I will, and I will say that I know that my client, Lisa Riccio, an amazing and very brave woman who was hoping to make law in a positive way, and we're so happy that she was able to do so. So under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the reauthorization, the statute added civil liability in addition to criminal penalties for traffickers. And the civil, the ability to sue for a civil remedy, it extends to direct traffickers, but it also extends to any other entity that enables the trafficking by financially benefiting from the trafficking, and also in a situation where this entity knew or should have known of the trafficking. So there's sort of two pieces to it. There's the financial piece, and there's the knowledge piece, that there has to be some level of culpability. But so our case was before our case, most of the cases had been against the direct traffickers. In Lisa's case, she really felt that the hotel where she was taken and abused and trafficked, she really felt that the hotel was at fault, because they had turned a blind eye to, they knew her trafficker and they had turned a blind eye. So we included in our case not only the man who had trafficked her, but also the hotel where it happened. And the case definitely made law, we think, in some helpful ways for future cases. And there were two levels of issues legally. The first issue was, for a entity like a hotel to be liable, there has to be some financial benefit to them, and what kind of financial benefit is required. The hotel argued that there would have to essentially be a bribe, some payment other than just the payment of the room rate. They said that the paying of the regular room rate wouldn't be enough of a financial benefit to hold the hotel accountable. And the district court actually dismissed the case, which we were frustrated by at the time, but we appealed to the First Circuit and got a wonderful decision from Justice Souter, who had retired from the Supreme Court and was sitting in our case by designation. And he confirmed that the payment of a room fee is enough of a financial benefit so that if a hotel gets a room fee, and if they knew or should have known of the trafficking, then there can be civil liability. And we also were involved I also was involved in a later case in Georgia against just a mess of hotels, where the same issue came up. Is the room fee enough for the financial part of civil liability? And what level of knowledge does the hotel have to be civilly liable? The hotels argued in that case that the people running the hotel had to know of the trafficking, and we got a wonderful opinion there from the 11th Circuit confirming that it's enough that they should have known. So I think where these cases collectively go, Lisa's case in Massachusetts, and in the First Circuit, and the Atlanta case in the 11th Circuit, is that if there is an entity such as a hotel, or these cases are now being filed against other entities like social media companies, banks, congregate care, but if there's an entity that receives some financial benefit from the trafficking, even if it's just a room fee or an ordinary pay fee, and if that entity knew or should have known of the trafficking, then there's an opportunity for civil recovery. And for our client, as I mentioned, the case was about more than money. It was also about accountability. And she has been thrilled to see the changes that have come about subsequently in the hotel industry. Absolutely trafficking is still happening in way too many places. But at least there's more awareness, at least there's more efforts to keep an eye out. The hotels are doing more trainings than they used to. Every time I walk into a hotel now, I see, warning signs about being aware of potential trafficking. And every time I see one of those, I think about Lisa, and I think about the difference that she hoped to make. So, these civil cases, I would say at a high level they are important because they can help a client financially. I think they're also important because they can make people pay attention to the terrible things that are happening to people involved in their businesses. And I will say that, there's absolutely benefit for these cases, but they're also hard. I've now represented a series of amazing trafficking survivors, and every single one of them, the response to the claim is she was just a prostitute. He was her boyfriend. Lisa, every time anything was said about her in court, she was, if she really wanted to get away, she could have gotten away. I recently represented a younger woman who was trafficked for the first time at age 14 by a family friend, and every single time a court filing was made, they called her a prostitute. I gotta tell you, that will confirm that a 14-year-old girl sold for sex by a family friend is not a prostitute. She's a survivor. She's a survivor of something terrible. So I will say, and I say this because these cases, they have a value. They have a value in terms of recovery. They have a value in terms of holding businesses accountable. But they're really, there's a lot of mud thrown at people who have survived amazing things. So there's a benefit, but there's a challenge. And I think a key to these cases is helping the clients through the challenges. I will say for Lisa, after having had mud slung at her for 2 years by the hotel that was our target, we did get to trial. And she testified on that stand, and she was amazing. And I think she also felt very empowered, and she knew she was making a difference. And I hope and think that she did.
No, thank you for that. And I think what Cindy perhaps won't say is that this case was incredibly monumental in leading to future litigation against hotels and hotels nationwide. And we've seen a significant increase in that litigation, but also, as you mentioned, responses by hotels in terms of affirmatively taking measures to identify trafficking. So it's sent a powerful message. And so I'll turn to Jose perhaps for our last question here. And so please do be thinking of questions that you have for the panel to sort of continue the conversation that Cindy raised about what are the challenges that survivors face within the existing legal system. Are there ways truly to think creatively about how to support survivors through that process, or is it just inevitably re-traumatizing? What are your thoughts?
It's inevitably re-traumatizing. No. I think there's many challenges that survivors face during the criminal investigation and the prosecution, and some of them are the same challenges and some of them are very different. I think first and foremost is remembering that a lot of these victims are dealing with an immense amount of trauma. And our lives do not stop because you are having an investigation on whatever crime has occurred here. And so I think within my own situation at the point of the investigation when it started, I was wholeheartedly in, but there were many moments where I was like, I'm done, I don't want to be part of this, I just want to disappear. Again, survivors are trying to live a normal life, and I think that some of their most traumatic experiences, especially in the prosecution side, are now being exposed in front of so many people and publicly, which is incredibly hard to do and very courageous for people to do, but it is extremely re-traumatizing. I also feel that many can be fearful of retaliation. And this isn't just retaliation from their trafficker and the threats that the trafficker may have, told them, but I think that there's also retaliation from community members, from family members who say, if you do this, we will, remove you from the family, or reject you from the family, or you're constantly picked on and ridiculed because of what you said publicly that could impact or feel that it stigmatizes and negatively impacts certain communities. I can say, the number of LGBTQ community members who came up to me and were like, how could you say something like that? Like, you wanted it. This is something that you did to yourself. And it's completely a lie. It's a misconception, but it's also not recognizing that a lot of the injustice, but also the lack of supports that LGBTQ individuals don't have, really kind of creates a lot of those situations, and the normalization for many community members that this is normal. And so a lot of what I've been trying to do is start to undo some of that idea that has become normalized within my community and share with them, like, this is not normal for a 16-year-old boy to having sexual relations with an adult. And it is not normal for a 15-year-old boy to be trafficked or participate in some kind of sex for money at that age. And so I think really trying to help people understand that has been a challenge, but I will continue doing that. I also think that there is also the distrust of authorities. I know through my entire case, the first thing I thought was, they're going to use me for my testimony and then they're going to put me in handcuffs and put me behind bars. And a lot of that stemmed from this idea that every time I came in contact with law enforcement, I was accused of being a perpetrator and not the victim in many of the cases, or just not being believed. And also the threats that I had received from my trafficker, who said, if you tell anybody what happened to you, mind you, I'm a 16-year-old boy hearing this, if you tell anyone, you're going to go to prison and you're going to get into a lot of trouble for what you chose to do. And so that stays with you for a very long time, and that stayed with me for over a decade. And many times I'm still trying to undo some of those things that I was told and made to believe in those moments. What does supports look like? So I'll move past all of the negativity and the challenges, but how can we do better in this work? I think first and foremost, it's being trauma-informed and victim-centered and having that approach anytime we're working with victims of crime who have experienced trauma. And it's really important for you to understand the difference between being victim-centered and being trauma-informed as well. I also think that accessible resources are vital. I cannot express that enough. I think this is where building community and collaboration within community is really, really important. Connecting with your local organizations, connecting with, you know, social workers who are working in the area, who are providing those direct services, really connecting with law enforcement, connecting with a whole collaborative team, so that if you have questions or need to find out more information or need resources, you know who to turn to, and it's not going to take you a month or a week or over 48 hours to get them in contact and get them to the places that they need to be. And last but not least, I really think that empowerment and agency is so important for the victims and survivors of these crimes, really making sure that they have control over their narrative and of their story, right, in their testimony, allowing them to paint the picture of what really happened to them. I know in my case, there were times where it felt like it needed to fit a certain narrative to support the prosecution, when sometimes it didn't feel true fully to my story and my perspective. And so really giving them that autonomy and that agency and empowerment is really, really important. So I also want to touch to the last point around justice and holding perpetrators accountable. I think there's many positive and negatives to holding perpetrators accountable and how that looks to and for survivors of this crime. I think that the positives, I think that there's a sense of justice, right? Holding your perpetrator accountable can feel like justice. When done properly, also it gives them a sense of validation, and it can ultimately offer them some closure in their life, and to be able to move forward with their life feeling like, okay, it's done, I'm ready to move on. But some of the negatives, and I think really kind of lie on the emotional side and the emotional impact that it can have on an individual. The easiest way, and it's very true and hard to say, but the emotional impact that this can have on a survivor, even just testifying and sharing their traumas, can be life-threatening. And I say that to not over-exaggerate, but because it is a reality that many survivors face after testifying. In my own trial, after the sentencing, I went out with the fellow survivors and many other friends after, and I got blackout, completely drunk, thinking that it was in celebration of, you know, my trafficker being sentenced. And I woke up the next day completely hungover, not remembering how I made it back to my hotel room. And I sat in the bathtub with a broken glass to my wrist, saying that I could no longer move forward, and I don't think that this is a life that I want to continue living. And I think that that would have been a complete loss for everyone who had worked on that case. And it's not a win, so it's not really over after you get a prosecution and the trafficker is charged. I think many survivors, if not all, are still dealing with a lot of the emotional and trauma that they endured, and are still being impacted for many, many years, sometimes a lifetime, moving on. So I think those are some really important pieces to really think about when working these cases, because there's many positives and negatives, but again, many challenges. But if done properly, I think it can be beneficial for both the prosecution and for the survivors that are testifying as well.
Thank you so much, Jose, not only for your courage, but I think you've been so wonderful about candidly speaking about what the real challenges are and demystifying that, which is incredibly important if we want to actually get at how we address them. So with that, I think there are a couple of microphones. So we'd love to take questions from students or faculty, advocates for this esteemed panel.
And before I turn it over to questions, first of all, I want to welcome questions from our Zoom audience as well. But I also wanted, before Audrey stands up, hold on, to introduce some folks here just so they can wave, right? So we've got our team from My Life, My Choice, we've got our team here from the Children's Advocacy Center. Both of these teams have very generously provided some resources to the back. Beth, can you say hi? Where Beth is, there's a number of brochures and resources that I would encourage those of us who are in the audience to leave with. And we'll be sharing those with everybody after in an email after this panel as well. And I also just want to invite those teams who are here who work on this day in, day out to also contribute to answering the questions if you think there's anything you might need to offer. So with that in mind, who would like to start?
Also, please do not be shy. And also, do not be shy or afraid to ask me a question. I am open to answering anything and everything or any questions that you might have as well.
And just while we have it, a quick shout out. We are so lucky in Massachusetts to have My Life My Choice, which is a survivor-led initiative, the Children's Advocacy Center that has really created the model around multidisciplinary teams. So if you're looking to either financially support or otherwise engage, we're lucky to have a wealth of incredible organizations here. What we have up? No, yes, here we go.
Thank you for the panel. The question that I had had to do with exploitation and how to draw the line in the sand. So I'm thinking here about youth recruitment for sports. There is a phenomenon of young individuals being recruited in the global business of sports at a very early age to join sports camps with a view to eventually, if they make it, they will love, but it's uncertain that they will, and there are years of investment, and at this end, of course, there is enormous profits for the owners of universities that have those teams, or the professional teams that will recruit the best of those kids that will be put at an early age. So, but being so recruited is immensely sought after by them and by their families. So, where do we draw the conceptual line about the nature of the result of the crime of sex trafficking? If the result is exploitation, how do we conceptually tame it so that we are neither under nor over-inclusive?
So I can answer this just very briefly and then turn it over. There have been increasing federal cases in the civil context around sports asking this very question. I think we're seeing novel claims as well, and how they have distinguished federally under the current law exploitation from trafficking is really looking at, there has to be recruitment, but also this pattern or practice to make that individual fear serious harm. And serious harm doesn't just mean physical harm, it could mean coercion in some way, financial harm, it could mean reputational harm. So in that context, if individuals are being recruited and their managers are exposing them to physical harm, sexual harm, we've seen some cases in the context of sexual abuse, reputational or financial harm, threatening them that say, you can't leave here unless you face certain financial penalties, that might be exploitation. The recruitment itself might not be sufficient. And then you might have, for example, lack of payment and other wage and hour type of violations. But that line is increasingly broadening in some ways because we're seeing coercion in a more expansive way than physical violence. But I don't know if anyone else has anything to add.
I would love to share something that is commonly questioned in regards to the lines being drawn between normalcy or cultural norms and exploitation. It's just to kind of get everyone's kind of brain starting to think of where do we draw the line. And we started this conversation around domestic servitude and also labor trafficking in the sense of a cultural home where children are expected to work. And I think that I questioned that as well coming from a Latino household where I felt like many things were expected of us, right? We had chores. Most kids have chores. And so is that considered a form of exploitation if a child is expected to do chores? probably not, right? But if they're being held in a way that they're not able to go to school, live a normal life, and not receiving the proper things that they need, you could start looking to a coercive and traumatic situation that could easily be exploitation. But that was something that we were kind of talking about and discussing, is where do we draw this line? Like, you're not going to have a child dial 911, my mom's making me clean my room, this should be illegal, I'm not getting paid for it. But it's really having that understanding of where this force, fraud, and coercion really lies. But I think that there's many situations like that, and like to Julie's point, I think that these situations are broadening and being brought to light. So the more that we hear of the different types of experiences, I think we'd be able to easily identify how these crimes are a form of exploitation.
I think there's a question over here.
So you started the panel talking about how most people envision this as, you know, like with Epstein or things that get a lot of attention in the news. And obviously we know now that that's not truly the bulk of these cases. The bulk of people who are impacted are not the ones who get all this media publicity. But there still has been a huge increase in people talking about that because of Epstein, because of this huge ring of powerful people involved in trafficking. How do you see that impacting both the educational piece that you've been talking a lot about, of people understanding what it means to be trafficked, what that looks like in the human trafficking, the labor trafficking context, the sex trafficking context, and how do you see that impacting the policy advocacy that you've all been doing?
I just want to say.
Sure, I'm happy to just add a little bit here. I think, no, I think that's right. I do think, you know, certainly, especially sex trafficking, it's naturally a subject matter that's going to grab headlines and grab people's attention. And so you're right, you know, especially with Epstein, with Sean Combs, others that have grabbed national attention. There has been some awareness raising. But I think, so that's helpful, right? Of course, like it's, you know, people are having conversations, people may be looking deeper into the subject, and that's helpful. But I think that to the extent that those cases, for those people sort of then symbolize what all trafficking is, then there's maybe where we get a little frustration, right? So we know that it is a broad range of things that could be brought forward in this under the human trafficking umbrella. And so not everything is Jeffrey Epstein or the Sean Combs. And so I think just asking folks to think deeper is a good thing. And so hopefully we'll move past this as the only explanation for what trafficking is, and ask and urge folks to look beyond Epstein. I guess that would be my response there.
Yeah, I had a very similar response, but just to add, I mean, the two cases had very different outcomes from Epstein and P. Diddy, Sean Combs. And I think that what comes from the Sean Combs case is some negative, stigmatized misconceptions of who victims of trafficking are, right? We heard, I'm trying to think of her name, Cassie Ventura's experience, and many people were like, she wanted it. She wanted to be there. She wanted to be part of that. And I think that there's so much more deeper into just the way of thinking, the trauma bonds, the emotional experience and toll that would have had on also these ideas that he may have planted in her head through grooming, and just the normalization of everything that she experienced, but also the complex nature of love and also someone that is harming you and hurting you. And I think that if you speak to any and many victims of domestic violence, they will share with you a lot of this information, and why individuals don't leave, why they stay, why they defend their perpetrator. And so I think that yes, there are those positive educational pieces and gain traction and really make people want to either understand it or think that they've understood it. But I really think it's important that people dig deeper and gain a real full understanding of the scope of what trafficking is and how it happens.
I would have said it is a classic case of discounting survivors of trafficking and not listening to them. You know, the Epstein case, like we hear the headlines, but there's actually this, you know, long story. My firm and I represented some of the Epstein survivors in a Supreme Court amicus, and the issue related to, you know, there were multiple Epstein prosecutions. There was like the first case where criminal charges were brought, and he sort of got a sweetheart plea deal. He went to jail for a very short time, and then he went on to do it again. And our client and a group of others who were among the early victims were very frustrated that there was that sweetheart deal that they had no participation in, no say in, and it was sort of a classic. I mean, it's a truly horrible example of what happens when you don't pay attention to the survivors. You know, the first round of survivors were not involved in the decision to give the sweetheart deal, and you know, he went on to traffic so many more young women. And I mean, I can't help commenting on the horribleness of the example of what happens when you don't listen to survivors.
The only other addition I was going to make is, you know, alongside these high-profile cases, we haven't talked much today about just the present moment, and we could speak for a while about that, but alongside that, we're seeing rapid defunding of many, if not most, anti-trafficking programs, the infrastructure that's been built over the last 20 years, immigration enforcement, and the erosion. We're seeing T visas for immigrant survivors. Those denials are at 70% right now of applications that are filed, as well as the erasure in public reports about the impact of trafficking on marginalized groups like LGBTQ individuals, despite the research. So I think there's also all of these pieces that we have to think about when we're thinking about whether we've made advances. One more question. Okay, great.
So this question is for Jose, and I was wondering if there was anything that you wish your lawyers had known while you were kind of prosecuting your case, and if there's anything that they could have done better to support you, and then more broadly, just generally as lawyers, like how we can best support survivors.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. You know, and to be quite honest, I work with attorneys quite often, and I usually have a list of things that attorneys can do better within these cases. I think for myself, I think it would have been really beneficial for me to have had a better built relationship. Getting to know one another, putting the case aside. Who are you? What do you do? Where are you from? What's life like? How are you today? Really making sure that victim-centered approach is also there. Do you have everything that you need? Do we care about your well-being? You know, do you need water? Do you need a place to stay? Do you have clothes for court? All of those things should be priority before even starting to talk about their traumas in their case, right? That's also going to help you build trust with the individual because it shows that you actually care about them and not just this case. And so I think that is priority and really, really important. I also wish that I had been better prepared. And what preparation may look like for you is completely different for preparation for somebody who's never been part of the legal system or has never gone to law school and doesn't understand a lot of the terminology that you're using or doesn't understand even like having to raise your right hand in court before you testify. Like, I was like, do I raise them? Am I, you know, I didn't know what to do, but that also builds this like fear and anxiety that is unnecessary. And so I think prep is really, really important, taking them on a walkthrough through the court, showing them how this is going to happen, really reviewing the questions that are going to be asked in testimony, and really like kind of hammering those questions and allowing them to answer truthfully and honesty to their experience, while also knowing that they can't share everything because some things could be damaging to their case. But yeah, and then I think the last piece would probably be the check-in. I mean, if you've built this relationship with them, and if they truly matter to you in this case, check back in on them. How are you doing? Stay in touch. Have that relationship with them, and if you can, continue to support them and find them resources or connect them to others who can connect them to the resources that they need. Because like I said, it's not, once the prosecution is over, it's not like rainbows and butterflies for that individual. More than anything, they're probably going to be dealing with more of their trauma than ever before, because it's opening up old wounds and facing new ones to add to that. So yeah, I think those would probably be the top 3 recommendations for attorneys when working on cases with survivors.
Yeah, I might add, hearing you say that, it's reminding me of, I mean, my client Lisa, we did, it was a civil case and we had more time, and we definitely wanted to prepare her, and she definitely wanted to be prepared. But every time, and it was definitely her impetus, not ours, but every time she came to talk about her testimony and talk about the case, I mean, she literally became physically ill. And you can certainly understand why, because she was talking about a horrible time in her life, and she was, getting ready to respond to this mud that she could have, run away if she was really scared of this guy. And it was, but it is, I guess I'd say the preparation is key, and I think when she got on the stand, she was very validated and very moving, and felt like she really told her story and captivated the courtroom, but it's hard. So I think having support for clients, we made sure to have support during those sessions, because they were really, really hard for her.
I just want to say a big thank you. Also, I saw some clinical colleagues in the room, so a final answer would be, if you're law students now, you can get some of those skills in the experiential program here at BC. I know you have incredible programs and learning in the classroom before you get out and practice.
Thanks, Joy. That was actually a perfect last question, because one of the things that I really wanted to encourage the students in the room and on Zoom to think about is connecting with the organizations that we have represented here today. So we're very, very lucky here in Massachusetts, as Julie points out, to have some of the leading, sort of the flagship survivor-centered advocacy organizations. My Life, My Choice, as well as the Children's Advocacy Center of Suffolk County. And these are both organizations, along with many others, right? Operation Exit, there's a ton of organizations that will help survivors of all different kinds of very traumatic crimes, but also provide technical assistance and training to advocates and lawyers that are seeking to support them in a trauma-informed and victim-centered way. And so I think one of the things that is incumbent on us as lawyers and or emerging lawyers is to really familiarize ourselves with those types of resources, so that wherever we go next, right, we may not be staying to practice here in Massachusetts. And even in Massachusetts, I have to say, having practiced both here locally in Suffolk County and at the federal level, the training is not the same. And so, being able to avail yourself of these opportunities to connect with people who really know what they're doing, and then to take those skills with you wherever you go, I think that's really what the goal of today is. It's about us leaving here with new ways to see, new questions to ask, and new tools to do the work. And the work can look very different depending on where you go or what you do. So first and foremost, I'm so grateful to Julie, to Jose, to Beth, and Cindy for your being here and for teaching us today. Also to our colleagues over at the CAC and My Life, My Choice for providing the resources that are back there. I'm going to share those resources after this panel. And in keeping in tune with what something you said, Jose, that really struck me, I want to leave you all with a piece of wisdom from Danielle Sered, who's a leading voice in rethinking what accountability and healing can look like. And Danielle writes, "The opposite of trauma is not help. The opposite of trauma is power." And I hope that stays with you for the next few weeks. Think about what that might mean for your work, because on February 3rd, we are welcoming Danielle as our spring fellow, and she will be delivering her community address over lunch. So I hope you'll all join us again for that. So thank you everybody for being here today.